Good morning. Today's class is about ideology. Many a time we talk about what is your ideology, or we also talk about what is your ideological position. In films also, we feel that often, and not just often but always, a filmmaker takes an ideological position that may be explicitly or implicitly stated in the film. A film, we must remember, is a sum total of the maker's attitudes, beliefs, social and cultural position. Ideology is visible or invisible and deeply embedded, so deeply embedded that it appears extremely natural. You see, some filmmakers, such as Shyam Benegal, they take a strong position. Govind Nihalani, he takes a strong position against the oppressed class. For example, in his film Akrosh, Shyam Benegal too, he has made a series of films set in in rural India, such as Ankur and Nishant and Susuman Samar, and where he talks about the exploitation and oppression of the rural poor. Okay. Also watch his Manthan. And these are the films that we will be talking about when we talk about the parallel cinema. So I thought this is a good time to give you some introduction to what is ideology. Now, so filmmakers can either take a very strong ideological stand, or ideology may just be embedded within their films, and it appears very natural. Not much attention is drawn, there is not much discussion of the dialectics, but at the same time we see that the filmmaker is taking a very strong position on something, and that's what the lecture is all about. Today's class is all about. Before we move on, let's watch this scene from Charlie Chaplin's 1936 Modern Times. Welcome back. I hope you liked the scene, and I hope you understood the ideology of the scene. What is it? Chaplin is actually talking about the assembly line production of those times, the Fordism of that period, and the exploitation of the small man, the growth of capitalism, as well as the exploitation, the victimization of the smaller person, although it is stated in a very humorous way, in a very comic way. So perhaps he is not breaking into big protests about capitalism, against capitalism. Still, it is an ideological movie. The filmmaker does take a very strong ideological position here. An ideology can be defined as a systematic body of ideas, attitudes, values, and perceptions. At the same time, it is also the collective views, attitudes, positions, and dogmas of a societal group. Ideology can be seen or unseen on screen. It can be conscious, or sometimes filmmakers project their views on screen in a very unconscious way. We have to also understand that ideology is also shaped by time and space. We are all creatures of the times we live in, the places we are born and raised, and very often ideologies represent the times and places where we come from, where we live in. One of the earliest films that we talk about when we discuss ideology is 1934 film. It was called Triumph of the Will. It's a German film directed by a woman filmmaker, Leni Riefenstahl, which is a propaganda film for Hitler, and it propagates his ideologies. An ideology here is very conscious and visible. However, earlier in Hollywood, the great D.W. Griffiths, he made a film called Birth of a Nation in 1915. This is a film which is set during the American Civil War, and critics have found the ideology as being outrageously racist. all the evil people in this film are black and the good people are white. The film also makes a case for the dreaded and racist Ku Klux Klan. The film was historically quite accurate. It was a blockbuster with realistic depiction of historical incidents such as assassination of Abraham Lincoln, Sherman's march through Georgia, these great episodes of the Civil War. But it was the kind of a movie which evoked extreme responses from the critics. In order to atone for the sin for the birth of a nation, later on D.W. Griffiths made a film called Intolerance, which is about the intolerance that prevailed in American society, and he made a case for equality among all. When you talk about ideology and social justice, then the name Karl Marx cannot be too far behind. Now, according to the Marxist school, any economic system seeks to perpetuate itself, and power holders seek to make us share their ways of thinking, including the idea that it is fitting that they be in control. It is to our advantage, and it's for our own good that the powers that be remain in control. The Marxist school of thought also talks about two concepts, base and superstructure. At the base, you have the means of production, the workers, and at superstructure, you have institutions such as family, education, mass media, religion, politics, judiciary, etc. So, workers at the bottom, and then there are forces that control the workers and means of production. We will be talking about this later on. Another key thinker of this period is Antonio Gramsci, who gives us the concept of hegemony. Hegemony for Gramsci is the winning of consent of the people, just like how according to Marx, we are conditioned to believe that the powers to be are there and they exist for our own good. In the same way, hegemony describes the winning of consent of the common person. The idea is that those at the top, they support dominant ideology, and they so condition those at the bottom that they willingly or unwillingly, most of the time willingly, support the dominant ideology. Within the Western world, the dominant ideology comprises white, middle class, heterosexual, male. So this is important. You can always apply these constructs to our situations as well. According to Gramsci, the dominant groups govern and the subordinates are made to see that it is the general interest to collude with that construct. This consensus happens not by coercion but from a desire to belong to a socio-political cultural system. People do not want to be left out, they do not want to be seen as misfits, so therefore they join and express support. So therefore, the common person expresses consensus with the hegemonic values of the dominant group. And what are these dominant ideologies? Belief in set family values and structures, heterosexuality, upward social mobility. You see, counterculture was against all these things. I keep talking about the ideology of 5 easy pieces starring Jack Nicholson and directed by Bob Rafelson, which is like a major document of counterculture movement, and where the hero decries family values, constructs of upward social mobility, and the belief in the great American dream. Okay. So cinema reveals these values. The majority of cinema, the dominant cinema, values and sort of reveals the values of preserving family values and structures, social harmony, mobility, and all these constructs are natural and desirable and unquestionable. Now, there is another theory, that is the Frankfurt School of German Marxists. particularly as represented by the works of Theodor Adorno, who attempted to develop an understanding of the dehumanizing institutions and the processes of a capitalistic society. Horkheimer's critical theory is a study of capitalist society moving towards a new level of ideological sophistication. He suggests that culture has replaced religion as the new opium of the masses in framing a certain order of conformism. So what we see in popular culture such as cinema and music, that has become an opium of the masses, and it's that ideology that is propagated through these means that has become the way we should live, the desirable way of life. The Frankfurt School was dismissive of mass entertainment, considering it as depoliticizing the general public. Because of industrialization, films, books and music are easy to reproduce, and this, according to the Frankfurt School, has changed culture into merely yet another commodity. So these are the major names. The Frankfurters, Adorno and Horkheimer. We have been talking about Leni Riefenstahl and her propagandist film, Triumph of Will. D.W. Griffiths, who made Birth of a Nation. Then we have also talked about Gramsci, and another important theorist is Althusser. Cinema talks, and cinema has genres. We have already done a considerable amount of genre study. We will be doing some more genres also soon. So I am talking about genres and how ideology is reflected in film cinematic genres. Genres follow a classic narrative. They support a closure and a resolution, and they provide simple answers to very complex issues. For example, we have already seen how Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times satirizes the assembly line production of that period, where workers have become a part of the machines around them. At the same time, we have Don Siegel's Dirty Harry, 1971 film starring Clint Eastwood, where Harry Callaghan embodies fierce individualism and right to violence, so taking the right-wing ideology to extreme. It bears the hallmark of the 1970s attitude towards violence, gender and race. Tony Scott's Top Gun, 1986 movie starring Tom Cruise, many of us may not regard it as a great ideological vehicle, but it is. It positions the spectators culturally, as it sets an agenda and provides solution to the problems, and also plays on binary oppositions. Maverick versus other pilots. Maverick is played by Tom Cruise. US versus Soviets. Team players versus individuals, and no prizes for guessing that our hero is a maverick and an individual. And in his character, the film reaffirms the myth of the dominant male. Now, I have been talking about Louis Althusser. In his book Lenin and Philosophy, he says that art does have a quite particular and a specific relationship with ideology. What art makes us see and therefore gives to us in the form of seeing, perceiving and feeling is the ideology from which it is born, in which it bases, from which it detaches itself as art, and to which it alludes. He gives us two terms, ISA, that is ideological state apparatuses, and RSA, the repressive state apparatuses. ISA, that is the ideological state apparatuses, church, family, education, legal system, media. This body or these bodies persuade us to believe or behave in a particular manner. RSA, it comprises the government agencies, police, courts, prison, armed forces. These are repressive state apparatuses. If you do not subscribe to ISA, then RSA comes into picture. That is the idea. There is another great theorist, Jean Baudrillard, who defines ideology as a belief that science points to something beyond themselves, that there is a depth beneath the surface. To know more about Baudrillard's theory of ideology, you should read his The Mirror of Production, and also Terry Gilt's Ideology and Introduction. Coming back to modern times and Charlie Chaplin, he conveyed ideology under the garb of slapstick comedy. The film, as we have already seen, satirizes the assembly line production, where Tramp is a factory worker and workers have also almost become like parts of machine around them. The film is an attack on poverty, unemployment, capitalism, exploitation of the workers. One of the greatest filmmakers whose films portrayed strong ideologies was the Italian filmmaker Pier Paolo Pasolini, who was a Marxist and a social nonconformist. He was an atheist also, and he directed one of the greatest films, The Gospel According to Matthew, in 1964, which reinforces the filmmaker's ideology, that is a radical indictment of materialism and social discrimination. So, two schools of filmmaking, fiercely Marxist, and you watch films such as Dirty Harry, that is Don Siegel's films, where Clint Eastwood, he goes to the other extreme, extremely right-wing thinking, and famous lines from Dirty Harry, "Go ahead, make my day." We know that here the hero embodies fierce individualism, and definitely we know that he is out to get bad guys also, and we root for him because in his character he embodies the dominant ideology. Watch these two clippings from Dirty Harry. Some of the films with extremely conscious ideology. I will be talking about Indian parallel cinema soon, but then let's talk about cinema from the West and also Hollywood. So, Bicycle Thieves, that we constantly keep talking about, Apocalypse Now, Wall Street, The Insider, Fahrenheit 9/11, and Inconvenient Truth, Children of Heaven, Turtles Can Fly. So, some of the greatest films that depict strong ideologies. Thank you very much. We'll meet for our next class.